IVF doesn't guarantee you a baby. Neither does freezing your eggs. And so I think that's one that I feel like has gotten a little bit more awareness now. People don't just assume IVF is going to be successful for me, because it is kind of a shock when patients find that out, that they're like, oh, this doesn't just work all the time. And we're like, no, some patients do multiple cycles. Some patients walk away with no baby after, half a dozen cycles. So I think that one's becoming more common. The one that I've been seeing recently is similar when it comes to egg freezing, because they're freezing eggs and not necessarily trying to conceive in that moment. They're preserving their fertility for later. They don't realize that egg freezing is also not a guarantee. Again, it's a chance in the future to have a child, but it does not guarantee that you're going to have a baby. Not all of those eggs are going to survive. They're not all going to fertilize. We can't guarantee anything. And so I really wish we had that conversation earlier in the process, so that people who are preserving their fertility or considering IVF know, maybe I should freeze another set of eggs, or consider freezing embryos, or maybe I should plan for potentially multiple IVF cycles, or be open to other things. This doesn't guarantee me anything. I see that a lot, especially with egg freezing. Patients come back and they're like, oh, this wasn't successful. Like, I had this whole thing in my mind that this was going to be here for me in a decade. And I put all of my hopes and dreams in those eggs, and it doesn't always work out that way, unfortunately.
10 years ago, when you froze your eggs, things are drastically different. How things were frozen, of how all of that was happening 10 years ago to now, and how technology has drastically changed from then to now.
Yeah, 100%. And techniques have gotten better, and media has gotten better. And so someone freezing their eggs now versus someone who froze their eggs 10 years ago are probably going to have different outcomes in terms of success.
For sure. Let's talk about embryo grading, because I can promise you on a weekly basis, we'll get intended parents that call us and say, we have 5AA, 4BB, a 5AB, a 4 whatever. We should be able to get pregnant. And I'm just like, well, first, we're not a medical facility, so go ask your doctor. But I think people need to understand kind of the grading. So can you walk us through how grading works and what it really tells us? Because I think there's just a lot of misinformation that people just don't really understand.
Absolutely. And it is one of my most asked questions as well. It's a very common question. And I always find it interesting that it's like one of the one things that's not talked about in this process, which I get. There's so much information. It's hard to get it all in there. But okay, so when we grade embryos, we are grading them based on what we see in the microscope. We want to grade embryos at a certain stage in development. It's called the blastocyst stage. And we're looking at 3 things during this stage. So every embryo has this shell around it, which we call the zona pellucida. That shell kind of protects the embryo during development, but the embryo ultimately has to hatch out of that shell to implant into the uterus. And so as that embryo grows, that shell gets thinner and thinner. The blastocyst cavity, which is kind of just the hole in the embryo, it's 3D, so that center part gets larger and larger. And so the first thing that we're looking at is the expansion, which is that number in the grading system. And we're looking at that blastocyst cavity and that zona. So you usually see a number 1 through 6, 3s, 4s, and 5s are very, very common. And that really tells us more of the maturity of the embryo than whether it's good or bad. I don't like to really consider the expansion good or bad. We're looking at more of how large is the embryo, how big is that blastocyst cavity, how thin is that zona as it gets larger and larger. Eventually, as the embryo gets more and more cells, that zona gets really, really thin. It starts to hatch out of that zona. And that's what we consider a 5. So a 3 is expanded, a 4 is fully expanded, meaning any second that embryo is going to start coming out of that zona. 5 is hatching. If you ever see pictures of an embryo that looks like it's pinched in the middle, a lot of people are like, oh my gosh, it's splitting. It's not splitting. It is actually coming out of the zona there. We call that hatching. That is a 5 on the grading scale. And then when it's fully out of that zona, we call that a 6. So that is the number in the grading system. The first letter corresponds to the ICM. That stands for inner cell mass. That is what becomes the baby. If you ever see pictures of embryos, there's usually like a bunch of cells and then there's like a ball of cells somewhere. That ball of cells is the ICM. It is graded on a letter scale like in school, A, B, C.